Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rennie, and today we're getting mindful about domestic violence and abuse. And more specifically, we're going to focus in on how men can be part of this solution as well. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got Allan Ball from my hometown in Adelaide, South Australia. How are you going, Allan?
Wonderful, Simon. It's good to be here, and thank you for the invite to have this conversation. Critical conversation, right?
Absolutely. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a little bit and really love the stuff that you put out there and calling guys to arms essentially and say, like, we've got to be part of the solution to this huge issue that's going around our country. But before we get there, I just want to introduce you to anyone who doesn't know who you are. And you are the director of White Ribbon Australia. And I loved how you framed how you talk about yourself. You're a change agent working with Australian boys and men to take decisive action to end men's violence against women. I really love this. What is a change agent? Talk us through it. Why do you call yourself a change agent? Why do we need change agents?
Yeah, well, Simon, thanks so much for your warm introduction and being here, particularly on you and this podcast celebrating its 1 year. So happy anniversary.
Thank you. It's my birthday tomorrow as well. So we're recording on the 18th of August. It's my 40th birthday tomorrow on the 19th, but also day one of Mindful Men. So thank you very much.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday all around and happy anniversaries. Being a change agent is exactly what we want to achieve amongst all Australian men. And when we talk about change agency, we're actually looking at unlocking people's potential, their skills, their knowledge sets, and their agency to be able to drive change. The good news in relationship to this issue is that most Australian men are not violent.
Yeah.
And that is the good news. What we know, though, is that most Australian men are apathetic at worst or indifferent at best in relationship to the issue. And that's for a myriad of reasons, but primarily because collectively we've shaken the finger at Australian men and said, hey, you're just the problem. And we haven't necessarily created a moment and all those opportunities to call them in. And so instead of indicting men, we need to invite them in to the conversation, but more importantly, invite them in to know that their agency, skills, and knowledge serves as a starting place to unlock and unleash change within the community so we can prevent all forms of men's violence and abuse towards women and girls.
Oh, I love it. That's a great answer to that. And to provide context to this, I'm interested to know, like we talked off air, that we're both social workers, and I often talk about growing up in the northern suburbs of Adelaide in the 80s and 90s and the noughties, and that's what defined my knowledge and understanding of mental health and masculinity. How did you get into this field? What was your roadmap to getting into this field, and why is this such an important topic for you?
When you have lived experience with the issue, it finds you, and you don't necessarily encouraged it or invited that in yourself. So I've had very personal lived experience as a child with this issue. And I've also seen the good and the not so good. My dad is my biggest hero. He is the biggest trailblazer, and I don't think he knew at the time that he was a trailblazer. My father and mother, they separated when I was quite young. My mum entered into a relationship with a not so nice individual at the time. My dad primarily took the care for me and my sister. And I recall how hard my dad was trying to figure it out. And I guess as an adult, you look now at yourself at the same age, or I'm a little bit older than when my dad was looking after me and raising me as a young nipper. But I look back now and think, my gosh, I haven't got it all figured out. And yet when you look at up to your dad or your parents at that age, you're like, they've got it figured out. They must do it. So I look back right now with a sense of deeper gratitude and gratefulness towards my father. But my mum died when I was young. And that moment is a milestone for any kid. I remember the day, January the 15th, 1995, a week after her 33rd birthday. And on January the 16th, 1995, my world changed completely. It became a new era, a new being. And even now I'm processing as I grow and I have milestones or I have my own life experiences and I want to share that. It's always there, it just lingers. And so domestic violence and abuse entered into our household quite young, and my mum and my dad were doing the best that they could to support and put their children first. So my dad ended up raising two kids, and me and my sister, we probably were big terrors. Well, I don't want to say that to about my sister, but I certainly was. And I recall particularly my dad working three jobs, keeping the food on the table, keeping the lights on. He was trailblazing in all regards to raising a kid, so particularly me, a kid that was coming out, understanding who he was, his sexuality. My dad would drive me with his 1984 Sigma station wagon into the city of Adelaide to go to my counselling session so I can understand, be supported and be proud of my homosexuality. And my dad would sit there because he didn't want his 14-year-old son to be alone in the CBD. And he would be raising my sister, combing her hair, understanding her needs, navigating boyfriends and those relationships with my sister. And at the time, my dad was absolutely doing his best. And I will never look back and say that he didn't do the best he could. And he was just trying to figure it out. And yet, as kids, it felt like he just loved us universally. And he definitely did. And he was doing his utmost to support us. And so knowing all of that and knowing how important the role of men are in raising children, in showing respect to everyone, everywhere, every time, my dad is my absolute hero when he taught me. And so now I want to impart those messages on to many other Australian men and to meet men where they're at, particularly around their role in promoting women's safety.
Yeah, I grew up driving around a Mitsubishi Sigma in Adelaide too, so maybe we're part of the Sigma club. It just gave me flashbacks of driving around listening to Billy Joel tapes and all sorts of stuff. But when we talk about domestic violence and abuse, and we often say it's a gendered issue, and I've learned about that. You've learned about that through our social work and so forth. But for the average person who's listening to this, what does that mean? What is a gendered issue, and why do men really need to stand up and take note of what's going on?
First and foremost, I will say that anybody can experience violence, abuse, and disrespect. And women absolutely have perpetrated and used violence and abuse and disrespect towards women, men, and children. But when I talk about men's violence against women and children, I'm not trying to negate or dismiss those other experiences. But the reality is we have 1 in 3 Australian women who have experienced some form of abuse in Australia. Every 4 minutes in Australia, a woman is experiencing disrespect, sexism, physical, psychological abuse or violence at the hands of a former or current intimate partner. And what we know is that sexual violence and rape particularly is an issue that is faced by women and experienced by women. 97% of rape and sexual assaults are perpetrated by a man. So it is a gendered issue. It 100% is. And when we look at the drivers of violence, particularly gender inequality, unhealthy notions of masculinity or being locked into what we call the man box, the peer-to-peer relationships we have with our other men and our peers in terms of what we're role modeling and accepting as a standard. We know these are the things that drive violence and abuse and disrespect. And so we make no apologies for that, but we don't get caught up with a he is or she is kind of conversation. What we do want to do is meet men, particularly where they're at, and work with the movable middlemen. And we know the term movable middle is a term that's kind of conveyed by consumer culture. It means if you're not loyal to one brand or another and you're kind of malleable in between. And how that applies to this social situation is that we want to talk to those men that are open-minded to progression, open-minded to learning and reflection, and applying that to unlock or unleash some positive change. And the bulk of the Australian men are in that movable middle. And so when we look at this as a gendered lens, I'm also mindful that that can create a sense of discomfort or apprehension for men to want to engage in. And so if there's one thing that I want Australian men who are listening to this podcast today to know, I'm inviting you in. You are welcome into this conversation. You are needed, because right now we're in a national crisis. As I record this podcast on the 18th of August, 2023, men have murdered allegedly 44 women in Australia. 44 women are no longer with us because a man chose violence. And the reality is, it's not getting any better. Some of the leading causes of concussion are based on intimate partner violence, men's violence towards women. Rape and sexual assault or sexual nature is a men's issue driven towards women. So it's about power and control and domination. And we're asking men collectively, we can lift the bar of what it means to be a good bloke in Australia, and we can be a better bystander or upstander and collectively call out these types of behaviours and reconstruct a better social norm.
Yeah, really powerful. Like just the data alone, you can see how it is such a gendered issue. And I've had an interesting journey into this space, like as a social worker, as a male social worker. And I'm glad you brought up that it's not just men against women. It's also, it can be the reverse. And that's a prickly subject. Every time I bring this up in this conversation, I'm shot down very quickly in the social work spaces that I'm in. And I find that very confronting. I'm like, isn't social work meant to be open to all these people? But I'm glad you've defined it that way and inviting guys into this conversation, because every time I'm in these conversations, my brick wall goes up as a protective. I'm like, I'm the minority here trying to give voice to some of these people as well. So I'm really glad that how you position yourself and position, your passion for this as well. It's really good to hear as well as another guy across the other side of Australia. Why is this such an issue though? Like, what is it about men in Australia? And I'm assuming men more globally as well. Like, and I guess our focus is on Australia. Why is this an issue? Why do we struggle so much in this area?
There's multiple reasons to it, and it kind of goes back to decades and decades of patriarchy, really, in a way that we've built the world. I mean, men built this world for men, for the benefit of men, and women have often and collectively been left out of that decision-making and in the power and equality conversations. So we have to look at the way that traditional gender norms were established. I mean, there wasn't a choice. There was an expectation that women played a certain role and men played another role. Men as the provider, women as the gatherer, and women staying at home, providing the nurture, men going off to work. And so there's a power imbalances derived into those kind of conversations. And there's plenty of amazing sociologists and philosophers that can kind of contribute much better than I could to this. But fundamentally, I like breaking it down into practical things that men can understand. What's happening right now is because men have had an upbringing that's been not so good, that has led them to be exposed to certain norms or behaviors, and they've just role modeling that. Men are experiencing all types of transformations at the moment. So they're now expected to, and we should be encourage them to be not stuck and constricted by this one notion of what it means to be a man. And we also know that men do choose violence because they feel like they can get away with it. We often talk about in White Ribbon Australia in our education sessions, when a man chooses violence towards his intimate partner and yet he doesn't choose violence towards the boss or the bus driver or the scientist or the person in the rear in walking down the street, there's a deliberate action there. And so we have to look at power, domination, and control. And I like to think about it in terms of some of the work we're doing with our young people and our You Can Ask Me panels. These are panels of amazing conversations around this very issue, but instead of telling young people what they should be feeling or thinking, we ask the young people to ask the questions that they're searching, particularly probably at night time. And in that moment, we answer their questions, but we're trying to develop their critical thinking skills. because we can't always be there to support our young people to do or to choose the right form of action, nor can we always be there for men. But we're asking to develop their critical thinking skills, and particularly around what does it mean to display and evoke a sense of respect in this moment, despite what I might be feeling or the circumstances that might be in front of me. How do I evoke a sense of respect? How am I upholding that in this moment? And maybe that might be just gently talking to a man around it. It might be a more deliberate and affirmative conversation. But what we must do is meet men where they're at. We should absolutely take the option off the table that says, men, you need to be this. Because you can't go from just being where we are, status quo, to utopia without building acceptable alternatives. It's a journey that we have to be on, and Australia is recognising that. And what we have right now is a national blueprint and a plan that paves the way, that puts men and boys particularly in the focus, and that plan is the National Plan to End Violence Towards Women and Children 2022 and 2032, which has had a significant buy-in by all tiers of state, territory and federal governments. But that's the blueprint. What does it mean to the everyday man? Well, he is in focus. And what that should do, if anything else, is absolutely and unequivocally say to him, you are invited in. Your solutions to solve this matter and are needed.
Yeah, I love it. There's the blueprint and I guess the work of White Ribbon. We've talked a lot about the very, very physical nature of family and domestic violence and abuse. Are you just focused on the physical? Because there are other aspects of family and domestic violence as well. And abuse is like, the emotional, there's financial and so forth. Do you do a bit of work in that space too?
Oh, 100%, Simon. And we know the physical violence is sometimes the most extreme forms of behaviour that are seen. Most of the behaviour that we see is something that we collectively call coercive control, and that is an umbrella term for a number of different behaviours, from psychological, spiritual, social, financial, emotional and technology facilitated abuse and violence. Men and women's relationships, or men and men, women and women's relationships in general are really complex. And so violence and abuse has many moments that it can appear. And so White Ribbon Australia looks at the whole spectrum. And that's why our vision is an Australia free of all forms of men's violence and abuse towards women. And violence and abuse is the collective term for all of that. But it can be overwhelming, right? Because men often say to us is like, well, maybe I shouldn't be in a relationship. Maybe it's not worth it. They're afraid to engage. And that in itself is an opportunity for us to meet that man where he's at, because we can understand and unpack individually, because some of the best conversations happen when you do it peer-to-peer, right? But the work of White Ribbon Australia has to look at the systems and the structures. And so that's why some of our advocacy asks, particularly right now, is around the criminalisation of coercive control to make it a standalone offence, as Tasmania did a decade ago, leading off the amazing work that happened in Scotland and in the Northern Hemisphere in the 1990s. So the criminalisation of coercive control is an advocacy ask of White Ribbon Australia at this current time. And what we want to achieve in that is not just using a one-prong approach by saying, hey, let's legislate this as a crime, but we want to also educate and inform the community about all of those variety of forms of violence and abuse. And we've got this amazing resource called the Digital Barbershop, which talks to coercive control and those behaviours. And we've just released our latest document, The Long Beard, which is a colloquial term for us talking about technology-facilitated abuse. And so I encourage your listeners to go online at whiteribbon.org.au and check out the barbershop resources, because there you can start to understand the very complexity of this issue.
I love how you brought that up. I was going to bring that up because I've been checking it out this morning. It's a really cool way of framing this really difficult subject to talk about for guys. And I think this is part of that meeting guys where they're at. The barbershop talks about the conversations that you have with your barber when you're getting your hair cut, or I can't grow facial hair outside of a few little stragglers. But I'd love to go and get a beard massage or something like that. Just not physically possible. And I'm losing my hair at a rate made of knots as well. So I'm not sure how long the barbershop's going to be applicable for me, but this is the kind of thing that guys really look into, and it's a really good read. I really do recommend it. And I'm going to be certainly putting it in the links in the show notes so people can access it.
Thank you, Simon.
I wanted to ask you about digital safety as well, because we talk very physical, very financial, spiritual, all that type of stuff. What about digital safety? Because we're seeing explosion of different social media platforms in the media over the last 10 years. You've seen a lot of sexting or sextortion and stuff like that through social media or phones and text messages. Can you give us a bit of insight into this and why it's so important to look at the digital space too?
We are now online digital beings. The reality is the in real life and the digital world is combined. And particularly for our young people, they are natives. They're not migrants, probably like you and I, Simon. I remember Gizmos and Gadgets being an early program in school, learning mathematics. And we had like computer time for like 1 hour a week. And it was fantastic, right? I'm grateful actually that I don't have a phone and social media access in high school right now. Hats off to the kids that are navigating that world, because we need to wrap our arms around them with as much support as possible. Digital abuse is growing. It is one of the crimes in Australia, or one of the issues in Australia that is growing. And the eSafety Commissioner particularly is doing an amazing amount of work in Australia trying to regulate social media, putting big tech companies, holding them to account. You've got the banks in Australia like CommBank that are just recently launched some digital financial abuse campaigns. You've got governments also putting a lot of money and effort into supporting knowledge acquisition of what is technology facilitated abuse. It is huge. It is a huge issue, and I can't underestimate it. And only a few weeks ago in Australia, the SBS did a documentary on incel or manosphere culture. And I encourage as many parents to watch that, not because I'm asking you to be frightened or fearful about what's going on, but so you can actually see how the digital world is the everything to young men. And when used well, it's great. It connects, it educates, it inspires, it creates jobs and livelihoods. But it's also got the dark side to it, and particularly those incels and servers and chat rooms that breed hate, unkindness, misogyny. And that in itself is a problem that we all need to be aware of if we are going to collectively tackle it.
Well, yeah. What's an incel? I've never heard of this phrase before.
Oh, look, I wish I didn't hear of this phrase. And my understanding, or the way that I define an incel, is a group of collective-minded individuals that are bounding together around a certain issue. So whether or not it's racism, homophobia, or misogyny. And the incels that we know, and we support men to understand the implications of it, the incels where men are coming in there because they're either got a hatred for women, or they feel like women reject them and they're trying to find a sense of brotherhood. That in itself, no matter which pathway you choose to come in, what happens and what we know in these servers or these online communities is once you're in there, it becomes an indoctrination. It becomes your world, and you go deeper and deeper. And of course, when you're only seeing or hearing a certain perspective, that slowly becomes your norm because it seeps into your DNA of who you are. That's hard to shake. And what we've seen, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, UK, America particularly, is that incel culture is going from online hatred, which is terrible, to in real life acts of violence, including murder. So it is a real problem. It is something that we have to address, and we have to take a multi-pronged approach to it. So we have to look at the digital ecosystem. So the only way we're going to combat this, though, is that if everybody is paying attention to it and is understanding the issue. So the eSafety Commissioner has these amazing resources that talks about incel culture. We support and amplify those messages from the eSafety Commissioner. And in our barbershop documentation on technology facilitated abuse, what we provide are very practical things that boys and men can copy and paste if they're experiencing a sense of backlash, unkindness online, particularly around women. So we try to develop their critical thinking, but that also requires us to give them some practical skill sets as well.
Yeah. I'm mindful that you've got to head off soon, but a couple more questions before I let you go is what can guys do now to make the change and shift the focus from a really negative one to more of an empowering one, a positive one as well? And you talked about in the emails that we've had the bro code. Talk us through the bro code. What can guys do together? How do we call it out? What's some practical things that we can do to be better in this space?
Well, first of all, we know one, men have the agency and power to be able to drive change. The great thing about the Australian spirit is that when we have national crises like floods, fires, avalanches, or even that national spirit to cheerlead the Matildas and get behind women's sport as we've done most recently in the most magical kind of ways, we are really good at coming together, particularly when we've got a shared common goal. And so I'm asking and urging Australian men to make women's safety your common goal, your everyday common goal. And it starts off by visiting our website, going to the digital barbershop and looking at the resources. There is one resource in particular, the full shave. It talks about the 10 things that men can do right now for free that takes little to no effort just to shift your mind and attitude towards kindness, openness, and unity. Then I would encourage men to start going on their ladder of engagement. And what I mean by that is start to call out sexism when you see it. Move away from the joke around misogyny or female's role or male role. Call that out. Don't think of yourself as being the fun police. Think of yourself as being the respecting reinforcer. And then we look at role modeling and around fathering and asking questions, particularly in the household. Is it a choice or an expectation around the jobs that we're doing? We can take those everyday moments to start creating our pathway of change. We don't expect all men to be the National Director of White Ribbon Australia. You don't have to go that far and that in depth into it. But what we're asking for you to do is to take, because we've taken off the table, nothing. So you can't be apathetic or indifferent or do nothing. That's off the table right now. You must do something. So get educated. That's the first thing that we can encourage you to do. And there are incredible resources on social media, amazing people to follow. I also look at the men as well. So look around because you'll see particularly men in your community that are doing really amazing things. So Simon, you've got a podcast. You've got White Ribbon Australia on talking about the role of men. That's amazing. In Sydney, we've got Zach, who runs Sydney Barbers, who is one of the White Ribbon Australia barbershops, who provides the haircuts and has a conversation with men using his barbershop skill sets. You've got Samson here in Adelaide, who has designed an app for women's safety called I'm Safe app. And he's used his technical prowess to develop that app to benefit women in the Australian and global community. So there are remarkable men in your life right now, and I'm hoping after listening to today's podcast, you're open-minded to it, you can see it, and I want you to start off by asking the question, what are you doing to promote women's safety? If you have that conversation with your mate, that's the first place that we can start.
Love it. And I'm going to add your social media in there as well, your LinkedIn pro. I love yours when it pops up on my feed because it's very insightful. So on that, if people want to follow you or touch base with you, where's the best place that they can look?
Well, look, a movement, I am one. I'm the first amongst many equals, but I do encourage them to go on LinkedIn, our Instagram, our Facebook account, our YouTube channel, because we've got amazing webinars on there. We've just recently hosted the incredible and my guru, Dr. Jackson Katz from America around men's leadership role. So follow White Ribbon Australia on our socials because it's up to date, it's contemporary, we're having those conversations. Jackson and I have just recently had a conversation and recorded it about the Barbie movie and about the role of Ken, and Ken actually not being the enemy, it's actually patriarchy that's the enemy. So we've had these amazing conversations, and then we've also had some really amazing practical conversations, as we did earlier in the year with Ifrin and Dixie and Jan around the role of workplaces about promoting respect. And if you're a man in a workplace right now, you can ask, do you have a DV policy, or can I actually lead the diversity and inclusive initiative if there isn't one? So I encourage you to check out our socials because it is an amazing web of contemporary knowledge, information, practical tips and tricks, and it also encourages you to get involved and play your role in promoting and in women's safety and unlocking your change.
Wonderful. And again, I'll put the links into White Ribbon's everything in the show notes so people can access them. Last question before I let you go is, we've talked about a pretty heavy topic in Australian culture at the moment and for some time now, but we want to leave it on a bit of a lighter note. And I always ask my guests to plug something that makes them feel good. So this could be anything at all, what you're watching, listening to, what you're doing as a self-care activity, what's just making you feel good. So maybe one of our listeners can try it out for themselves and feel good too.
I am part of the 5 a.m. club. So I encourage you to do it. I wake up every day and I spend time investing on myself. So I go to the gym, I digitally unplug and detox, and I work on my mind and my body 7 days a week, no break. So join the 5 a.m. club. And if you're in Adelaide or in any other gym across Australia, not that I want to plug a certain brand, but I am an Anytime Fitness member. And when I do travel this nation, I'm in that gym doing some sort of crazy cardio or weightlifting exercise. No matter what it is, the most important thing is I start off with that digital detox in the morning. I am just in my present moment working on myself, because that's fundamentally really important to find your own sense of stability and anchor. So join me in the 5 a.m. club.
Love it. I've recently started surfing lessons as well. So you have to get up pretty early to do that. So I'm onto that bandwagon already. So
I'm going to probably be cancelled here, but not in any of the Adelaide beaches. Way too cold. You're on the Sunshine Coast.
yeah, that's much nicer up here in the water at this time of year. But Allan, thanks so much for coming on the show today and getting mindful about violence against women and what men can do to be the change agents that we need them to be. So I really appreciate your time and thanks so much.
Well, happy birthday for tomorrow and happy 1 year anniversary of Mindful Men.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.